Hello, this is 321 Denmark, and my name is Line. Today we have a very special guest with us from Switzerland. Welcome to Daniele Ganser.
Hello, Line.
Hello, Daniele. You are a peace researcher and you are author of many books on US warfare and the false flag operations that have been made through history. And you got famous for your work on NATO's secret armies, and these studies were then well received at the university where you earned your degree in history. But
Mhm.
later, you got unpopular at this university for looking into something which then seemed to be a forbidden field of research. And I'm talking about 9/11.
Yeah.
Maybe you can start out by explaining in some more details what this conflict was about.
I did my PhD in history in the year 2001, in September 2001. And as you know, many remember on 9/11, 2001, there were terrorist attacks in the United States. And my PhD was into Operation Gladio and false flag terrorism. So in my PhD, I had really researched how you can scare a population by carrying out terrorist attacks and then blaming these attacks on your political opponent. And this was done in Italy. There were terrorist attacks, for instance, in Milano in 1969. And then these terrorist attacks were blamed on the communists to weaken the communists at the polls. This was strategy of tension in Italy. So I was very sensitive to the topic of terrorism due to my PhD research. And then when 9/11 happened, I was very suspicious. And I thought, well, is it true what US President George Bush tells the world, that Osama bin Laden did it and Al Qaeda, and that it was now necessary to start a war against Afghanistan? So I was very skeptical right from the beginning. And I read a lot of data on 9/11. And what really struck me, Lena, is that many people think that two planes hit two towers and then the towers went down. So plane, tower, tower, that's for most people 9/11. But there's a third tower that's called World Trade Center number 7. And World Trade Center number 7 collapsed on September 11, 2001, but it was not hit by a plane. So I wrote that book. It's this one, The Ruthless Empire. It's the same like in German, there's a different cover. And in that book, I say there's a third tower that collapsed on 9/11. And I talked to Swiss architects, and they said this was controlled demolition. So, I wrote an article in the Swiss newspaper that this is probably controlled demolition. And then the American embassy attacked me and said, you are a conspiracy theorist. So that's the problem I've had for the last 20 years, because it was in 2006 when I published the article. For 20 years now, I had to sort of live with that people attack me as being a conspiracy theorist because I say 9/11 is a lie. And, obviously I have problems at university here in Switzerland. I always thought, Swiss universities are independent. You can research anything that you think is interesting as long as you have the data. But the truth is, it's very difficult to research 9/11 in Switzerland. I guess in Denmark, it's the same. It's very difficult.
Yeah, but how these problems that you got at university where you were supposed to do independent research, how did they come out?
Oh, they just told me that I cannot become a professor if I continue to question 9/11. So in the end, I just created my own institute. It's called the Swiss Institute for Peace and Energy Research. And this is outside of the university. And I fund the institute through the books. I write these books and I give public talks, and people pay entrance to hear the talk. And, so I'm an independent intellectual. I'm no longer teaching students at university because I did that for many years. I was at Basel University at the history department. I was at Zurich University at the history department. I was at Lucerne University, also at the history department. I was at St. Gallen University at the economics department. So, I've seen universities from the inside for many years, Swiss universities. But I have to tell you, just generally speaking, 9/11 is still a no-go area. Still today, in 2025, if somebody says World Trade Center 7 has been brought down through controlled demolition, and that's the summary of my research, people say, oh no, that's not possible. It's impossible, and therefore we don't want to hear it.
Okay, but can I ask, when you have seen it so many places, do you think it's just a convention among the professors, or do you think it has something to do with where the money comes from?
It has to do where the money comes from. I mean, the Swiss government doesn't want to have any problems with the United States.
Mhm.
And obviously, the money for Swiss universities comes from the population, from the Swiss population. That's the same in Denmark. So the population pays taxes, and this money goes to the government. And the government, with some of the money, we have different cantons in Switzerland. It's 26 cantons, and not every canton has its own university, but it is local money from the people. And then the government says, oh, this is really delicate. And Dr. Ganser is a historian who touches on delicate subjects, and we don't want him to do that. So basically, it's just reputation management. So we say we don't want to look at 9/11. It's too delicate. We can't do this in Switzerland, and therefore, please don't talk about it. But I didn't accept this. I didn't. I was a friend of Tommy Hansen, and he didn't accept many restrictions that people put on him. I mean, it's important as a researcher that you just follow the truth. And if the government tells you to not, look into something, it makes it almost more interesting.
Would you call it censorship, what they're doing?
Yeah, this
Okay.
is censorship. I mean, if we cannot talk about 9/11, because 9/11 started the so-called war on terrorism. So 3 weeks after 9/11, there was the start of the war against Afghanistan on 7 October 2001. And this war lasted for 20 years. It was not only the Americans were there, also the British were there, the French were there, the Germans were there, many NATO countries were there. So it's very important to look at 9/11 just to understand Afghanistan. Furthermore, the war against Iraq, which started in 2003, was also linked to 9/11. Bush and Cheney said, well, Saddam Hussein has links to the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which was nonsense. There were no links, but they wanted to attack Iraq, and they just framed it into this 9/11 story. And then 2011, they attacked Libya, another Muslim country. And 2014, US President Barack Obama bombed Syria. So, all these events have been influenced by 9/11. And I always say, if we try to understand the 21st century, we must also look at 9/11. I'm not saying it's the most important historical event ever. I'm not saying that. But it's an important historical event. And therefore, we cannot just accept the narrative of the US government.
All right. So then later, I mean, 1 year ago, you have experienced protests against you from Antifa, which is a left radical movement. And that's despite the fact that the core message in your lectures, as you also just said here, is to promote world peace. So
Yeah.
when Antifa is protesting against you, how was the framing of their protests on your work?
Yes, that's true. These protests were in Germany. I give public talks in Germany. There's like 500 people or 1,000 people, sometimes also 2,000 people who buy a ticket to come to listen to the talk. And then I give talks, for instance, in Berlin or in Hamburg or in Munich. I also give talks in Austria, in Vienna or in Graz. And I give talks in Switzerland, like Zurich and Bern. So I do these three countries, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And I give public talks. And so I don't remember whether it was Kiel or where it was. They had an Antifa demonstration outside. I think it was maybe 20 or 30 people. I think it was Berlin. Yeah. Falkensee. This is a little bit outside of Berlin. And they said, Daniele Ganser says that we shouldn't send weapons to Ukraine. And that's exactly what I say. It's true. I say the German government shouldn't send weapons to Ukraine because the whole conflict in Ukraine is a bit more complicated than what people always say. People say, oh, Ukraine was at peace. And then on the 24th of February 2022, the Russians invaded. So 100% of the blame is with the Russians. Then I say, oh, look, that's not exactly true. I mean, the Russians, President Putin has to be blamed for the invasion. That's illegal. You cannot invade another country. Like, the Germans couldn't invade France, and the French are not allowed to bomb Libya, and the US are not allowed to bomb Iraq. So this is a violation of international law. That's true. So, the Russians have some of the blame. But when we look back in history, we see that in Ukraine in 2014, the government was overthrown, and Americans were involved, above all Victoria Nuland of the State Department, and also right-wing extremists in Ukraine. And we also have to look at this coup d'etat in Kiev in 2014. Therefore, Germany should stay neutral and not send any weapons to Zelensky, but it should stay neutral and help to facilitate peace. So the Antifa says, no, that's not true. There was never a coup d'etat in 2014, and we have to send weapons. So it's really a ridiculous situation that the Antifa promotes the government's position. It just promotes the official position of the German government, which is to send weapons to Zelensky. But I was not impressed. I was not impressed by Antifa. There's just a small group. I mean, we were like, I don't know, 600 people in the room when I gave the lectures, and just 20 people outside doing the protesting.
Yeah, but it's interesting that they are with the government against you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're with the government, and they're the left, they're the left. And people who think, oh, the left has always promoted peace. No, that's not the case, because in Germany, the left, I mean, these are the Social Democrats, the Reds, and the Greens. And they were in government, and that's the last government together with the FDP, with the Liberals. And they were just under the Chancellor Olaf Scholz. They were just sending weapons to Ukraine the whole time. And when you criticize the government, you basically had Antifa protesting in front of your lecture hall. And that's the funny thing, people ask, why is the government telling the Antifa to protest? Or how does it all work? And I don't know. I actually don't know how Antifa organizes itself, but it's very strange that they protest against a lecture which is asking for peace.
Yeah, do you remember if they called you names, or did they say, call your work something?
They usually say that I'm just, spreading Russian propaganda when I say, hey, there was a coup d'etat in Kiev 2014. So it's something that in Germany, at the time in 2014, that was reported in the newspapers and also on television, that there was a coup d'etat, that this was illegal. I mean, President Yanukovych was overthrown. That was the Ukrainian president. And he didn't want Ukraine to join NATO. So that was basically the structure within Ukraine, that the Americans wanted to have Ukraine in NATO. And the Russians said, no, we don't want that. And that goes back to the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, where US President Bush, again, Bush, who was also in office during 9/11, where Bush said, we want to invite Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And that's where the war in Ukraine really started. We have to go back to 2008. And the records are very clear. The Americans tried to drag Ukraine into NATO. Now with the new Trump administration, Pete Hegseth, who's now the defense secretary, has said, oh no, Ukraine will not join NATO. But there's maybe 1 million people killed in the meantime. And it's a disaster for Europe. I mean, 1 million, we don't really know the figures, but maybe 500,000 Ukrainians, 500,000 Russians. It's very hard to say when the war is going on, but it could be 1 million people killed. That's absolute disaster. That this happened in Europe. I mean, Russia is a European country, and Ukraine is a European country. I mean, Russia, obviously, until the Ural, is in Europe. The other part is in Asia, but Moscow, like Paris and Copenhagen, these are European cities. So I'm very sad that the analysis of both the Ukrainian war as well as the analysis of 9/11 is restricted. It's not allowed to talk about World Trade Center 7 on 9/11. And when you come to Ukraine, it's not allowed to talk about February 20, 2014. That was the day when snipers were on the roofs of the buildings on the Maidan. Kiev is the capital of Ukraine. The Maidan was that very famous square where the protests were. So you had protesters, you had police, and then you had snipers on the roofs, and they shot the police and they also shot the demonstrators. So they created total chaos. People thought, oh, it's got to be the police. The demonstrators thought it must be the police, and the police thought, oh, it must be the demonstrator. But it was a third party on the roofs, and they created chaos. And you know, it's well documented. It's a Canadian scholar, Katvanovsky, who's researched this very well. It was a coup d'état. I mean, I'm 100% sure, but people don't want to talk about it.
Yeah. So, as I hear you, you think there is a lot of censorship going on these topics
Yes.
on the internet and in the mainstream media. Do you think this kind of censorship has increased during the last centuries?
Oh, you know, there's always been censorship. I mean, if you take the situation 500 years ago, people didn't have any books, people didn't have any laptops, people didn't have any smartphones, and they couldn't even read. So, okay, 500 years ago, the information structure was was worse, if you want, you know. And then in 1950, if you so want, after the Second World War, governments were able to influence people through television because in 1950 for the first time we had television in Europe and in America. So during the Second World War there was no television. The Nazis, they only had radio. Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister of Hitler, he only had radio. He used it a lot, but you know, that's what they had. And they had cinemas, but then you had to walk to the cinema and watch something. But in 1950, that was the first next step in the information revolution. We had television. And I think it's fair to say that 50 years from 1950 to 2000, people were just sitting in front of the television and they believed everything they saw. I mean, not everybody, but you know, people were just sitting there and believing what they see. So that was highly manipulated, highly manipulated. And then 2001, one of the big TV events was 9/11. And now the work to bring more information about this does not come from television. It comes from the internet. Okay, there's people on the internet or magazines like 321, which I really like a lot. You know, it's a very important magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they work for new messages, new context. Also, for instance, the explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline. Seymour Hersh, who said, you know, the Americans blew up Nord Stream. He published this on Substack. So he published it on the internet. You know, he couldn't publish it in the New York Times or Fox News or CNN. So what we have today is, yes, we have a lot of censorship. But on the other hand, I think it's very hard or harder than ever in history to control the flow of information. You know, it's like water. It just finds new ways. Okay. And then this is blocked and the YouTube channel is taken down. And then you have information going through here and there. And people who want to find out what's going on, they can find the data. So I'm not pessimistic. I actually think that more and more people switch off their television and they say, okay, now I read 321 and I see what they tell me. And they will find it's much more interesting. But obviously, some people are still sitting in front of the television and they believe everything that comes out of the television. But it's more and more obvious also after, you know, the Corona discussion, that people realize it's not the full story. I'm not saying that everything is wrong that comes out of television. You know, I watch football sometimes on television. So I guess, you know, the football results are correct.
Yeah, okay. But would you think that this kind of censorship, which is happening nowadays, is has taken new shapes?
I think so. Yeah. You know, I think different governments try to suppress independent media. They just try to do that. But it's very difficult because if they suppress, people get more and more suspicious. Like one of the big things is in Germany, Russia Today, RT, is forbidden. I think in Denmark as well. Is it also in Switzerland? It's not forbidden. Is it forbidden in Denmark?
Yeah, it's
RT?
forbidden.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's censorship. As a very basic position in the Enlightenment, we said we should be allowed to read everything. There's nothing that we shouldn't be allowed to read. We should read everything. And then we should see what is the best argument. And then government said, oh, yeah, but you should not be allowed to read the Russian propaganda. Therefore, RT is forbidden. But in Switzerland, because we're not part of the European Union, we still can read RT on our smartphones and on our laptops. So I read RT and I compare it to the Swiss mainstream, SRF, and to the German mainstream, ARD. And, I don't do it every day, but every second day I check how does, RT write and what does the Swiss government write and what's the German government. Obviously, they don't say what the government, but they are the leading journalists in the state-funded mainstream. And it's just very interesting. You see, it's a completely different narrative. So the censorship question is something that we should all be aware of. It's a problem. You're right. It's a problem. It's there. People try to censor. And a big example is that in the European Union, it has been forbidden to watch RT. And I think that's crazy. There should be no censorship. But the second thing I want to stress is that there's more YouTube channels who spread the story, and if you take down one YouTube channel, there's a new one coming up, and so the information warfare is going on. I think it's not possible to stop the information revolution. People will have more information on many topics, like the Ukrainian war. If you want to research the overthrow of the government in 2014, you can. You can today. You go into the data and you have to really search for something, and then you can find it. Yeah, but censorship is something that has been with human history for the last 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm. So there's a Wikipedia page about you, and it says you are
A bad one.
About you and your work, and it says you are a conspiracy theorist. Do you have a comment on that?
It's just the word that you get if you research 9/11. Okay, if you research 9/11 and you say, "Oh, World Trade Center 7 was brought down through controlled demolition," then in your Wikipedia entry, it will immediately say you're a conspiracy theorist. So basically, as a scholar, as a historian, you only have the choice between saying, "Oh, 9/11, that was exactly the way US President George Bush said." Then you have a good Wikipedia entry. Or you say, "Oh, the US government lied about 9/11, then you have a bad Wikipedia entry. So I saw this, in my Wikipedia entry got from bad to worse. They just write it. And the thing is, many people think Wikipedia is independent. It's not. There's a very small group of people who write on Wikipedia, and they're not even known by name. People think, well, you can correct something in Wikipedia if there's a problem. So many people who like my books or my lectures try to correct my article and say, "Oh no, that's not true what you write here," and they try to change it and write, "He poses important questions regarding World Trade Center 7." And then they're blocked and they cannot make that change in Wikipedia. So it's my article is blocked, and it's only a small group of maybe 5 people who control this article. And so it's not an open encyclopedia, how they say.
Would you call that censorship?
Oh yeah, that is censorship. I mean, it's digital defamation, And I have to live with it. I mean, I got used to it, but in the beginning, I was not happy. I was going like, "Oh, now I have very bad Wikipedia entry," and it's obviously the first. If anybody who doesn't know me puts in my name on the internet, that's the first entry you get, the Wikipedia entry, and then they click on it, and then there's like the second word. Okay, the first word is my Daniele. That's correct. It's my first name, Then Ganser, that's also correct, my second name. And I says, I was born in Switzerland in 72. That's also correct. But then they start, he spreads conspiracy theories, you know. And that just for people who are not trained gives them a bad feeling. So they think, oh, I shouldn't listen to him. And that's the idea. But some people who are very well trained in information warfare, they know if somebody in Wikipedia is being attacked as a conspiracy theorist, that probably means that he's very critical of the CIA and of NATO. And that's how it is. So if somebody criticizes the CIA or NATO or 9/11 narrative, then you're being attacked as a conspiracy theorist. I got used to it now. I mean, I just do my work. You know, it's up for people to read the books and make up their minds. You know, to basically those who are interested in my work, they will buy the book or they will watch on my YouTube channel a talk, and then they can make up their mind. I mean, I'm just 100% sure that World Trade Center 7 was brought down through controlled demolition. So everybody can at least see, okay, that's the position of this Swiss historian. And I'm also sure 100% that NATO had secret armies in the Cold War and that they were set up by the CIA and MI6 and that they were linked to acts of terrorism. I'm 100% sure. It's my PhD. I researched this. And I'm also 100% sure that in 2014, there was an illegal coup d'etat in Ukraine, which created such a chaos that now we are in this Ukrainian war, which we need to end. We really need to end this war in Ukraine. But if we don't go into these deep events, it's events of the deep state, if we don't look at them, also the assassination of John F. Kennedy, you know, I'm convinced that the Zapruder film shows that the head of Kennedy is thrown back, okay? And on Wikipedia it says, oh, Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy, but he was behind him. So how can the head go back? There was another shooter in front of Kennedy, so that was a conspiracy. So Kennedy was murdered. And probably Alan Dulles, the former director of the CIA, was involved. It's all in my book. But, you know, these are big stories. John F. Kennedy, 9/11, Ukraine. These are very, very big stories. And they just try to hedge the discourse. And I'm just an independent Swiss scholar who says, oh, no, I'm not impressed. I do my work. And if you then want to write something bad about me, I cannot do anything about it. I have to live with it.
All right. So we don't have a lot of time left. Maybe you want to just put a few words on your friendship with Tommy Hansen, who was the founder of the 321 magazine.
I really like Tommy. You know, he's now dead, and when I look at his life, I just think he has had a great life in the sense of he stood up for truth. You know, he was like Julian Assange. You know, Julian Assange is still alive, but people look for heroes. They say, oh, you know, with all this corruption and all these lies, you know, who are the guys who stand up and say, okay, I don't accept these lies. I want to speak the truth. And so Tommy, for me, is one of these heroes. He, you know, he wouldn't. Some people told him, "Oh, you can't say this, you can't say that." And he just didn't care. He said, "I research it, and if I'm convinced, you know, that this is the situation, and I will publish it." So he was a very, very courageous man, and I think people in Denmark should be proud that Tommy Hansen was one of you. You know, he was one of you. One of your country, like John Pilger, for instance, in Great Britain, or in Australia, Julian Assange, or Edward Snowden, you know, in the United States, who now lives in Moscow. But there always come people who take a lot of disadvantages for their personal life. They get, you know, a shitstorm, they get a bad Wikipedia entry, they get people attacking them, they get bad emails, whatever. And they say, I don't care. I don't care. I just want the truth. It's important, especially to promote peace. So Tommy was, we met in Berlin and in other places. And whenever we met, we just exchanged thoughts. What do you know about this? What do you know about that? And for me, he was a peace activist. And when you die, at the end of your life, everybody has to die. Then you reflect, what have I done? And I think Tommy, he was able to die with a smile because he can say, you know, I worked for truth. I worked for peace. You can't ask for more in your life.
Thank you for your time and for your work. And for everybody who were watching this, if you want to see more from Daniele Ganser, you can, for example, look up his YouTube channel, Daniele Ganser. Then have a nice day, and thank you for watching.
Thank you, Line. Bye bye.
Bye.